Welcome, welcome, welcome. You are listening to, you are witnessing, you are watching, you have just joined Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan. Joining me is my main man, my co-host, my confidant, Mr. David Seaton. How are you, sir?
What's going on? What's going on?
Good to see you, my friend.
Snowed last night.
There's just a little dusting, you know.
Yeah, but it snowed in Texas.
Oh, okay. I guess that's news.
I had a friend of mine that I used to work with. She lives and works in El Paso,
Okay.
which is a border town.
Yep.
She said it snowed in El Paso.
Well, that means that we got another decade before people in Texas believe in global warming now.
At least.
'Cause
At least.
that's all the evidence they need. It snowed here. What are you guys talking about? That's unfortunate.
Very much so. I remember in the 5th grade, just to take that one step further, in the 5th grade in earth science, when you would learn about the difference between climate and weather.
Yes.
In the 5th grade.
Right.
And then grown people go out and say, see, it's snowing. It can't be the climate can't be getting warmer. Snow.
Right. So with that said, amazingly enough, that's like the least of the crazy things going on this week, right? We've got a lot. First of all, we want to thank all the folks that are watching on Facebook Live. Please share the video as well, and please feel free to comment. Talk about these topics that we are sure are going to interest you and hopefully enlighten and inform you as well. What we got today, Dave? We're going to talk about the Trump administration's decision to declare that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, what that means and why we should care. We have an excellent guest joining us today, Professor John Quigley, out of Ohio State University. He's going to help us parse that situation and figure out what is going on with that, some of the possible ramifications and the motivations behind it. And later in the show, you and I are going to really chop up what's going on with this Al Franken thing. For anyone that doesn't know, Al Franken is a senator out of Minnesota that has recently decided to resign his seat. He won't do it till sometime early next year, I guess. But
he said sometime in the near future.
Yeah. So he's going to be resigning his seat based upon sexual assault or sexual misconduct allegations, I guess is a
sexual
better
harassment,
word.
Not assault.
Yeah. That's what I said. Misconduct. So again, he has allegations out there numbering, I think, 8 women at this point. The last time we discussed this, it had just happened that the first person had come out. So we'll definitely talk about that. You know, was that a smart move for the Democratic Party? Was it the right thing to do morally? Was it the right thing to do politically? What is the plus minus? We'll definitely have that conversation. Of course, we'll talk about Roy Moore and that as well, and what the Republicans have been doing with this dilemma and problem as well, as it has definitely affected both parties. And we'll talk about the way both parties have decided to try and respond to the incidents that have happened. So we've had people dropping left and right. How many? We had 3 people on the Hill leave this week.
That is correct. We had the one Republican senator that he propositioned one of his staff members to be a surrogate.
2 of them
for his wife.
Right.
Offered to pay her $5 million, but then it came out that he wanted her to be a surrogate, but he wanted to fertilize the egg in the old-fashioned way.
Right. Well, for $5 million. And when I read that, I'm like, where did he get $5 million from? I'm like, he's a wait, what is this? But he, so it's that's an amazing story. That's one of the weirder ones. And then of course we had the other the other congressman, the black guy. What's his name?
I can't remember. I know who you're talking about.
Conyers, was it? Not Conyers.
Not Conyers. It was he has a funny first name, Alcy or Albie or something.
Oh no, that's somebody else. That's another one.
Oh, see,
I'm talking the guy. He's been in Congress 52 years. He was the longest running, and he they called him a civil rights icon at first. Nancy Pelosi said
that was Conyers.
Conyers, right? So he resigned this week too.
Okay, I thought you were talking about somebody else.
No,
there's so many.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Conyers resigned. You got the gentleman you just mentioned. We got Al Franken. And Alcee Hastings.
That's what I was thinking about.
Right, that's what you're thinking about. He just has some charges come out. They're going to figure that out too. He paid money out of a settlement though. So taxpayer-funded settlement.
So did the other Republican senator that gave the
$84,000, right?
But they've already gone through ethics and said that he's fine.
Right. So that's
surprising.
So as you can see, we've got a lot to talk about the second half of the show. It's going to be a great show. We love your input. Go ahead, Facebook Live people. send us some comments. You're welcome to give us a call as well at 708-223-8953. We'd love to receive a call and talk to you on the phone. So again, it's going to be a power-packed hour. We're going to get started. What else do you need, Dave?
Right, really quickly, for those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, do us a favor and share the show, because the conversation about Israel and Jerusalem has a really strong religious component to the story that hasn't really been talked about a lot in mainstream. And we'd love to get some feedback from some of our Christian religious individuals who are connoisseurs of the show,
and Jewish, please,
and Jewish. Anybody who's religious. I mean, anyone who has any religious background or attends church regularly or what have you. There's a really, like I said, a really strong religious component to this entire story that really deserves to be illuminated, so it gives a full context.
Absolutely. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will be joined by Professor John Quigley. Thank you for listening to Humanity in the Headlines. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. So this is something that I saw, Dave, this week that I really wanted to talk about on the show. As I've watched, because, this is one of those things, too, we've had a little time to kind of see the fallout from it, watch it marinate, and really see how the mainstream media was going to cover it. And it's amazing because the first day, so for all of our audiences that maybe just tuned in, we're discussing the Trump administration's decision to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel, and really what that means for the United States and for the world. And so when I saw that it was coming out that he was going to make the decision, and I saw that world leaders were trying to reach out to him to discourage him from doing so, and he obviously didn't listen to their counsel or advice. When I first saw it, the media's response, as they were speaking to people that were representing either Palestine or the Palestinian Authority, there was a lot of focus on the 3 days of rage. Yeah, and I remember Allison, I can't remember her last name, the girl from CNN with Chris Cuomo.
Right.
She was interviewing a lady, and even the interviewee had to say, okay, I understand that you want to talk about this 3 days of rage, but there's more context to this than this. And then by the second day, CNN wasn't covering it at all. Nothing. And that's, in my opinion, in my estimation, that's mainly because Palestinians were bringing rocks to a gunfight. And because there was no real damage that the Palestinians could do, it didn't warrant any news coverage at all. And unfortunately, the fact that they weren't able to meet the Israeli forces like toe to toe shouldn't warrant the story that there's severe loss of life or some type of terrorist act.
Exactly.
There should be more to the story, and it's worth covering from a human rights perspective.
Just when you talk about that, just to give some context to the people who are watching, and those again who are watching on Facebook, please share the show. We want to get this out to especially any people who are religious. We want to get you in this conversation. The United States is the third largest country in the world with about 320 million people. Israel has about, according to as of 2016, has 8.5 million people. It is amazing how two countries with about 330 million people could plunge the rest of the 7 billion people on the planet into this global issue that just boils down to two countries, and really an antiquated, and I would argue a misinterpretation of the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Bible.
Well, as you can see, guys, joining us on Facebook Live, listening on IntellectualRadio.com, on YouTube, This is a complicated subject and topic. Helping us to parse this situation today is Professor John B. Quigley of Ohio State University. How are you today, sir?
Very good.
Thank you so much for joining us. Professor Quigley, and your specialty again is international law, is that correct?
That's right.
Absolutely. So we really do thank you for joining us today to help us and our listeners better understand this situation. So if I may ask you again, just as we were talking, as this unfurled this week, I think it was Wednesday or so, Tuesday or Wednesday, what was your initial reaction to the president's decision to declare Israel to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel? What did you make of that initially?
Well, I thought it was an immensely short-sighted thing to do, that it would not achieve any useful purpose, that it was probably done by the president for his own self-interest in terms of domestic politics, without very much thought to the impact on the rest of the world or with respect to the conflict there. I was immediately concerned that it was a decision that would lead to people dying and being injured. And that, unfortunately, has come to pass within the last day or two.
Absolutely. So if I may ask you this then, have you had an opportunity then to kind of think about his true motivation for wanting to do this? Because, you know, we've seen that he just wanted to appease his base. We've seen people say that he did this for Sheldon Adelson. If you follow the money, that's kind of where it leads back to Sheldon Adelson. If you could kind of talk about the plus minus of what the United States would have to gain by doing this, and then obviously consequently what we could lose.
Well, I don't think the United States has anything to gain, but I don't think President Trump is concerned about the United States. I think he's more concerned about himself. And I think it was a result of what you mentioned, that he has gotten tremendous amounts of money from Sheldon Adelson, who has been pushing him in this direction. And he thinks that there is a segment of his political base that will find this to be an appropriate action.
This is David, and again, when I was talking about this, right before we brought you in, I was talking about the religious aspect of this. Can you kind of, again, but I don't want to get too deep, I guess, but just on the surface of it, when you start talking about Jerusalem, that you have this theory in evangelical fundamentalist Christian faith that's specific to the United States, that believes that Jerusalem being named the capital of Israel is going to bring on or spur on the events of the second coming of Christ. And that's something that's talked about in the book of Revelation. But even when you start talking about this end time and this version that we teach about that part of the Bible, about the rapture and the second coming, it really was written by this guy, John Nelson Darby, in the 1830s. So when you start talking about Christianity as a whole, going back 2,000 years, most of Christianity, or all of Christianity outside of the United States, doesn't subscribe to this literal interpretation in the Bible. So really what we're talking about just the sect of Christianity specific to the United States and the Christian fundamentalist right who have access to Trump, who are trying to set these events in motion internationally for what they believe is going to happen at the end of times. Do I have that right?
Yes, and I think this is in part why the decision is seen so negatively in other parts of the world, because what you've just described as to the beliefs of a segment of the population in the United States is not something that is shared widely.
And again, even when you start talking about the three major Abrahamic, and I think I pronounced that right, or the three major religions in the world, when you start talking about Judaism, Christianity, and the Muslim faith, they all three of those faiths have some sort of religious claim to the city of Jerusalem that dates back to the Old Testament. So even if you don't want to get into the specifics of the strain of Christianity in this country, we're talking about half of the planet that's arguing about their claims to a small piece of land in the middle of Israel.
Yes, I think that's right, and that does, at least in part, explain the great concern about the city. I mean, it's been said that the religious attachment to Jerusalem is a real curse for the city.
Exactly.
Because it does mean you have this kind of conflict.
And again, to kind of go to your point right before that, when we start talking about the motivation of the Trump administration, we know that Donald Trump is not some deep religious person. I mean, this is the man who got up and at a Christian event during the campaign and said that one of his favorite scriptures was from 2 Corinthians. So we know that Donald Trump himself does not have some deep understanding of biblical philosophy and prophecy and all this. At the end of the day, when you're talking about his personal motivation, we're talking about the one group that has not significantly gone down in their support of Donald Trump since the election is the evangelical Christian right. And they subscribe to this end time prophecy. So he feels inclined to try and make that particular group happy. So because that's the only group that nearly has the same amount of support that he had when he was running for president.
Yes, I'm afraid that's right.
So here's a question I wanted to ask you, Professor, quickly. This is Atiba. When we look at some of the fallout of this, we've been looking to broker a 2-state solution for some time. And the United States has been an integral part of the negotiations for that. This decision by the Trump administration, what does it do to our moral capital with not just the Palestinian community, but throughout the world? Because I think people at this point may look at us and then have to wonder, why should we ever make a deal with the United States when they could just back out of it at any time or flip their position at any time the way that we've appeared to have done here?
Well, I think much of the world is already wondering about the United States and how it was able to elect someone of Mr. Trump's stripe, and this will just further indicate to them that we've gone off the deep end. I mean, in a way, it's putting together many elements in the world that have been at odds with each other. You find kind of unanimous criticism from Russia and from Western Europe, which have been at odds with each other. You find that Hamas and Fatah are, in a way, thrown together by this because they are united in their hatred of what has been done by the United States.
That's amazing. He's been able to unite then everyone except in this country that he represents. But that's a sad state of affairs. Let me ask you this as well, Professor, because again, do you think this decision has any implications on the Iranian deal with the nuclear weapons? Because once again, we've heard Trump intimate that he'd like to get out of that deal, although Iran has been technically has been in complete compliance with the deal, and we've seen them really diminish much of their uranium, so forth, their stockpiles. But at the same time, again, would people of Arab descent now look at Donald Trump with sort of a side eye based on this deal that he's kind of blown up? And do you think this has implications for the Iranian deal in the future?
Yes, I think you're right that this will make Arabs so skeptical of him that they will not buy into his anti-Iranian thrust. And the fact that it does denigrate him in the eyes of the world means that it's going to be more difficult for him to go it alone to get rid of the Iranian nuclear deal.
And again, this is David. As I'm listening to you speak, and that was a great question. But when I'm thinking about it even deeper, when you think of the Middle East, for the most part you think about Persians and Arabs, and you think about, generally speaking, people of color. Would it be too far for me to? Would I be going too far if I said that you could really boil down a lot of the the strife and the violence in the Middle East as it pertains specifically to Israel, down to the fact that the West went into the Middle East and carved out the nation of Israel in 1948 and put this this group of people in the middle of the Middle East, and they're surrounded by Persians and Arabs, all around them to the north, south, east, and west, and Africans, if you're talking about Egypt. And really, this is just the people. I mean, the original indigenous people who have been there for thousands of years had what they thought was their holy land with one of their most holy cities carved out for a group of people who had not been there
by force.
I mean, really, when we start looking into the United States and what they're doing internationally, you could really boil down all of the contemporary violence in the Middle East just down to that one event that happened in 1948, the carving out and creation of a modern Israeli state.
Well, I think you're right that is the widespread perception in much of the world, at least outside of Europe and maybe even in Europe. That is that Israel was a colonialist enterprise sponsored by Europe and the United States, and that it brought a population of Europeans into a third world area, and that the Europeans who came in then ran the indigenous population out of the country by force, which was done in 1948. And this had been sponsored earlier by Britain, if you go back to the time of the First World War. And then in 1948, when the Israeli government was able to establish itself and to engage in ethnic cleansing against the population.
And I'm glad you said that, because I was trying to avoid saying that, but I'm glad you said that when they carved out the nation of Israel in 1948, they populated it with Europeans. That's really and again, I've hesitated to kind of say that aloud, but by you kind of opening the door by saying Europeans, I want to see if I can take it one step further. When you start looking at Donald Trump and his white supremacist views, or at least how they're perceived in this country, you had a huge kerfuffle that, even today, when he went down to Mississippi to speak at the Civil Rights Museum that was being opened down there, even though just last night he was speaking in Florida, in Pensacola, supporting Roy Moore. And Roy Moore, in the last week, they just released where he was talking about, when he was at a rally and an African American asked him, when was the last time that the United States was great, and he said slavery. When you start putting all of these pieces together, that Donald Trump is at the very least just all the way up to being a borderline racist, and now, big surprise, he goes in the middle of the Middle East and picks a country that, like you just said, was populated with Europeans, and he's going to take a city that has been argued about, we could say it, for thousands of years, and give it to the white country.
Is that an oversimplification?
Yes, I'm afraid that is the case. The Zionist movement was conceived in Europe. It was a way of dealing with the issue of Europe's Jews, and the idea was to take over this territory, and that then was done by force. And Jerusalem, in particular, to speak specifically about the city that's the subject of controversy now, the population of Jerusalem was run out by force in 1948 by the Israeli military, or what became the Israeli military.
Exactly.
In the year 1948.
So would it, just following this to its natural conclusion, would it be too far to say that the Palestinians are within their right as a nation state to do the things that they've been doing. And you know, when the story is written by the West, we read the story and we view the Palestinians as terrorists, and Mahmoud Abbas as a supporter of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. But really, those are just, I guess if we wanted to use American terms, those are just militia groups that are indigenous to the Palestinian region that are fighting for their statehood, and now it's being co-opted and stolen away from them from a American president who doesn't even understand the geopolitical implications of what he set in motion.
Well, yes, and if you go back to the 1950s, 1960s, it was understood that colonial peoples had a right to resist their oppression and to gain their own independence, and that is exactly how the situation of the Palestinians is perceived in much of the world now.
Isn't it amazing that in this country, in the United States, we celebrate July 4th as our date of independence, and we write songs about the rocket's red glare, bombs bursting in air, and we celebrate with fireworks, and that we threw tea into the harbor, and we just lionize and deify all of the people of that time. But now the Palestinians, who are doing the exact same thing, we want to call them terrorists.
Yeah, exactly. You know, if you think of a population that was excluded from its own country, refused the opportunity to return to it for a period of half a century, you get to begin to understand a bit of how they are perceiving all of this.
So, Professor, this is Atiba again. I'd like to ask you two major questions. The first one is, why should Americans care? In other words, you know, what is it about this? Because again, I've seen a disconnect in the mainstream media, in all the stations, not just CNN. I cited them earlier, but even the more liberal-minded MSNBC, certainly Fox News could care less. But generally speaking, Americans don't really care about anything that doesn't happen in America. For a lot of Americans, America is the world. So why? The first question is, why should Americans care? And two, where does that leave us now? How do we, if at all, fix this?
Well, if you think about what we've done in the Middle East, it is something that we should care about. We've initiated a huge war in Afghanistan that's gone on for over a decade. We invaded Iraq, which has given rise to the ISIL phenomenon. And if I were a recruiter for ISIL, I would be very happy right now because I would be putting clips of President Trump into my propaganda videos in order to recruit people to my cause. So if you want to think about it in terms of the self-interest of the United States, this is a hugely negative move.
And to take that just a step further, doesn't that literally put American lives at risk when you think about the number of Americans at different embassies in Arab states around the world? When you think about just the number of personnel from our armed services that are out in the world, doesn't that put their lives more at risk, this type of decision?
Oh, it does. If you think about Afghanistan and all of these attacks that have occurred against U.S. troops by Afghans who are posing as members of the Afghan military, and then they get into a base and set up a bomb. I can imagine much more of that coming now.
The irony being, at the end of the day, that when and if that happens, and in all likelihood, it's probably more appropriate to say when it happens, the Trump administration is going to use that as an excuse for major retaliation.
And the Muslim ban.
Of course, he will say, these are bad guys, these are evil people, and we have to go after them. And that just perpetuates the cycle of violence.
So with that said, because I don't want to be a pessimist, I'd like to do my best to be an optimist. Again, then what can the United States recover from this? Can we get back the little bit of moral authority that we did have, and certainly the ability to be trusted by these communities in the future?
Well, I think that is possible to some extent. If you think back to the beginning of President Obama's first 4 years in office, Tyrone made a speech that seemed very conciliatory, The opinion polls after that speech showed that the view of the United States went up considerably in the Arab world. Then, of course, he wasn't able to follow through very much. But the fact that you did have that uptick in opinion, indicates that if the United States were to take a major turn, there I think would be a turnaround in views of our country.
Professor Quigley, thank you for joining us today and helping us dissect all of this. Could you please just tell the people who are watching and listening today how they can follow you or where they can find your work?
Well, I write op-ed pieces that are picked up by quite a few newspapers. So if you just Google my name, you'll find a good bit of my writing.
We appreciate you for joining us. I'm sure
Absolutely.
that this isn't the end of this story, and we will be sure to have you back for part 2 because I'm sure it's coming up sooner rather than later. Thank you for joining us today on Humanity in the Headlines.
Thank you.
Wow.
Again, very informative.
But again, I just really want, again, those of you who are watching, please share this show because I think there's a severe shortage and disconnect in this country, especially among the Christian community and especially among the fundamentalist Christian community, because it is a foregone conclusion. I mean, again, I remember being a child and my mother listening to the 700 Club and that's all they talked about in the 80s was the second coming and the rapture and how it was all tied to Israel. But in the 80s, during the Reagan years, the state and religion was still pretty much separated.
Right.
But religion has co-opted the Republican Party. The Republican Party thought they were co-opting the religious right to get votes. But now the religious right has their tentacles so deep into the Republican Party that you've really got, think about this for a second. 30% of this country is solidly behind Donald Trump. And a smaller percentage of that are these religious conservatives, these far-right religious Christian fundamentalists that we're talking about that have this warped of the Bible. So you've got a very small sliver of Americans who control the White House vis-a-vis Donald Trump because he has no core. He's just doing what he thinks will be advantageous to him. So at the end of the day, you've got a small percentage of people who have a misinterpretation of the Bible who are controlling the security of the world. That's dangerous.
Absolutely.
And that's why we definitely need to have a division between religion and government, specifically for that reason.
Right. That's just one of the many reasons.
That's the most important reason, because if Donald Trump was a Ronald Reagan, he would have his own ideology, or if he was learned in government, he would say, well, like, we can't do that because this will happen. But you've got a dilettante sitting in the White House. So, and it's widely said that he just listens to or espouses the last thing that he heard.
Right.
So all these people have to do is just make sure they go see him at 8:30 or 8:45 p.m. and put whatever they want to in his ear. And that's the thing he's going to act on next.
Right. Yeah, we're definitely in a very precarious situation with this president, and that's why getting this information out is all the more important. So please share the show. Please we still love to get your comments and talk about this further. We'd love to extend this conversation. And what we're going to do right now is
before we go, don't take my word for it on this. For those of you who are interested enough, Google John Nelson Darby and read up on this issue for yourself, and you will find that the whole rapture, everything we're talking about with Jerusalem and Israel right now, all goes back to this guy who invented this theory out of whole cloth in the 1830s. And then that'll kind of give you some context. So that's your homework. Don't just take my word for it, or just don't take our word for it. Go and Google it, read it for yourself, so that you can be informed about what's going on right now that's going to affect each and every one of us.
There it is. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we discuss the Democratic decision to force out Mr. Al Franken. Was that the good move? We'll be back on Humanity in the Headlines. All right, good people, we are back on Humanity in the Headlines. We thank you for sticking with us. If you just missed it, we had an amazing conversation with Professor John Quigley of Ohio State University, his specialty, again, being international law. He helped us parse through and understand this whole thing with Jerusalem and Israel better. Please feel free to go back and listen to that. I'll be posting the show just, as soon as we're done, so you can get a hold of that. But right now, for the last few minutes, we want to talk politics. We want to talk about something happening here. It's no secret, David and I are both left-leaning, Democratic/independent, depending upon the topic. We don't ascribe to anything 100%.
Yeah, there's some things I'm conservative about.
Right, me too.
Right.
There's some things I'm conservative about. There's some things I'm liberal about. But with that said, it's no secret where we pretty much stand on these things. And we definitely, from our perspective, want to talk about what happened this week with Al Franken, and then how it, and again, all the subsequent decisions that have been made during the week with all these other people. So with that said, Dave, I got to ask the question. What was your initial reaction when you saw that Al Franken would be announcing, and then subsequently did announce that he would be resigning?
Well, we had a very interesting conversation when we discussed this last time after the show.
Right.
And I am of the same belief that I was then. He is not guilty of, in our law, we make distinctions all the time. We have first and second degree murder. We have voluntary and involuntary manslaughter, and then we have degrees on that. We have wrongful death. We make distinctions in the law all of the time based on the severity of whatever offense that was committed. And then along that continuum or that hierarchy, we ascribe penalties that are commensurate with the severity of the offense. You would not expect someone who is guilty of first degree murder to get the same sentence as someone who is guilty of second degree involuntary manslaughter. By very definition of the crime by which you are being the crime that you're being accused of, there's a distinction that's being made. And the same thing I think is applicable here. And you've heard this if you've been following this story at all. You've heard this story as it's gone on, and you've heard more female commentators and male commentators coming out talking about Al Franken and saying, we're not sure if the punishment fits the crime. At the end of the day, Al Franken was guilty of poor decisions that he made. He was guilty of some things that were in poor taste. He was guilty of things that were that certainly crossed the line. But he wasn't guilty of anything criminal. So such that, and then the irony of it, and this is where it gets really dangerous. The eighth offender that came out, that was actually the catalyst to him coming out and announcing his resignation on the Huffington Post, and was anonymous. Think about that. Think about how dangerous that is, that you could lose your job because you are accused of something by someone anonymously. You don't even know. So now Al Franken has to go and read this story, and he has to comb through. Think about what a senator does. He goes out and meets tens of thousands of people and takes tens of thousands of pictures, and he's out at social events all the time. So he has to comb through his mind while he's reading this anonymous accusation against him in the Huffington Post, and he's forced to comb through every event he's had in his mind and say, oh, was it this person? No, because I had my hand on her hip. Was it this person? No, because I put my hand on her shoulder. Was it this person? Well, yeah, because that's crazy that you could lose your job for something that's not criminal, but the accuser accuse you anonymously. That's going too far.
Okay. I have a different beef with it. So I do not believe he should have stepped down when he did. I can understand the temptation for the Democratic Party to try and reclaim the moral authority of the situation. But here's my bigger beef. My bigger beef with the whole Al Franken situation is of everyone that's been accused, and we've had a lot of people accused, he was the only one that suggested and then was cooperating with an actual ethics investigation.
He asked for it.
So, and to me, and that's kind of, I'll go back to our first discussion. I've always wanted him to go through that ethics that process needed to play itself out. And now, if at the end of that process he decided to step down, or it was decided that he should, that's fine. But we needed to go through the process to see to get all of the accusers out there, to go through the stories, not to necessarily prove them liars or anything like that, but to show the rest of the world and the other party what the actual process looks like. So now we still have not had anyone go through the process. And now, to your point, the standard becomes you got accused, you got to go. When it should be, when you should have an opportunity to at least go through the process. And that was my problem, because everybody else has either, Donald Trump has not had a process at all. He was accused of, just like Al Franken was, but of many more severe things. But there's no ethics probe into Donald Trump's allegations.
Right.
And there's no ethics probe into Roy Moore's allegations, and there may or may not be once he'll likely become the senator, but if he does, there may or may not be. But we had an opportunity here to set a new standard with Al Franken, and he was willing to go through it and fully cooperate. And I think we really dropped the ball, and we were premature in trying and asking him to leave when we did. So with us being in agreement on that, what do you foresee as the fallout?
Well, here's the thing. We do know, for example, that there have been at least all these payouts that have happened because there's been these outrage that taxpayer money is going to pay these sexual harassment settlements from individuals. We were talking about that a moment ago at the beginning of the show. The one Republican senator who resigned, who was going to pay $5 million to his someone on his staff to be the surrogate for him and his wife. You got $5 million, you can pay your own $84,000 fine.
Right.
You and I shouldn't have to pay that. But here's the problem. The Republican Party, we can talk about the ethics investigation all day long. At the end of the day, the Republican Party is still in charge. It hasn't held Donald Trump accountable. Not even for the Access Hollywood and for him bragging about his sexual assault in the past. They haven't held him accountable for very plainly illegal acts that he has committed while in office. They're waffling back and forth right now about Senator McConnell. Mitch McConnell has all but gone back on his word, saying whether or not they're going to have an ethics investigation into Roy Moore should he win this Tuesday. I have no confidence in this iteration of the Republican Party even being fair arbiters of the systems that we have in place to hold people accountable. The one Republican congressman who paid the $84,000, he's saying that he'll pay it back. I was trying to bring up his name real
Trent
quickly.
Franks?
No, that was Blake Farenthold of Texas. If you look at this guy, I can't even. I don't want to make light of it, but he paid $84,000. He said he's going to pay, the $84,000 was paid by taxpayers. He says he's going to pay it back, but I believe I read that he had gone through the ethics investigation and he was exonerated.
Right.
How can you be exonerated when there was a payment that was made for the $84,000, but then turn around? And again, the Republicans are complete hypocrites on this. I unfortunately, like I think I said this last week, I still have a sliver of hope that there's going to be a small percentage of Republicans, enough Republicans of independents and an overwhelming majority of Democrats who are going to be able to change the structure of Congress in 2018 and the presidency in 2020, and because the pendulum has swung too far to the right. And in politics, typically when the pendulum swings too hard in one direction or the other,
has to be a course correction.
There's always a course correction. And I think in 2000, I'm confident in the American people. Again, that 30% of Trump supporters out there, Trump could do whatever, and they're not going to turn against him. But I believe that all we need is 20% of Republicans, 75% of independents, and 90% of the Democrats, and we're going to be able to change Congress and take the presidency away from Donald Trump in 2020 and get back to some normalcy.
Absolutely. So, I'm with you on that, and I hope you're right. I really do. I don't have much confidence in Republicans at this point, but let me
none in Republicans.
Let me play something for you, and this is like why I don't have any confidence. Let's listen to this sound, and then you tell me what you think.
Alabama 40 years ago in Alabama, it was a different world. 40 years ago in Alabama, people could get married at 13 and 14 years old. My grandmother at 13 was married. At 15, had 2 children and a husband and a job. If Roy Moore was guilty, if he was at the mall hitting on this 14-year-old, 40 years ago in Alabama, there's a lot of mamas and daddies that'd be thrilled that their 14-year-old was getting hit on by a district attorney. Well, no. Because I disagree with a lot of them.
All right.
I think it's unfair. I would argue that thought process is in a minority of the minority. I don't think you and I are both parents, and you and I both have daughters.
Right.
My daughter is 17. Your daughter is she's 19.
Mm-hmm.
So we know. So both you and I would never concede or sign off on our 14-year-old daughter being hit on by a 30-year-old man. We barely tolerate our 14-year-old daughter getting hit on by a 14-year-old boy,
right.
But we certainly wouldn't do that. So again, I believe that while that might be true, and it certainly is true, you don't have to go back that far in history in this country where it was legal for, a 13 or 14-year-old girl can get married today if her parents sign off on it.
Okay. But my point in playing that was, that's an Alabama voter talking amongst other Alabama voters.
Sure.
If they're a minority of a minority, why is Roy Moore going to win?
Roy Moore is going to win because of tribalism. I think the majority of Republicans would not espouse that view, but unfortunately,
but it doesn't matter what they'd espouse if they'd still vote for him, is my point.
But my point is that most Republicans are one issue voters. There's only one issue that they care about. What's that issue?
Abortion.
And that's what a lot of Republicans down there have said. They have said, hey, it might be true, it might not be true, but Roy Moore is anti-abortion. And then to kind of prove that, they've gone out and lied on Doug Jones and said Doug Jones, supports abortion up until the day of birth, which he doesn't, which you can't get in any of the 50 states. So this is about tribalism. This is about lying to low information voters, because that's the bottom line. The bottom line is that, and I've said this before, if the average person doesn't have enough information to make an informed decision, then that means if you have less information than the average person, then you definitely can't make the right decision. I think it's fair to say that Alabama is full of underinformed, misinformed, and uninformed, malinformed Republican voters, and on top of that, they're one issue voters, and on top of that, they're fundamentalist right-wing Christians who are being told by their pastors on Sundays, you better vote for Roy Moore because he's anti-abortion. When you put all of that into someone who doesn't have enough information to make an informed decision in the first place, you get a Donald Trump.
Exactly. So again, I'm hoping you're right. I'm hoping that in 2018 and in 2020, we get a course correction. I am not wholly confident at this point. I do like to see Donald Trump's poll numbers going down consistently. He is losing voters, but at the very same time, Democrats still are not charging their base. They still are not gathering enthusiasm amongst their base, because it's going to take two things. It's going to take Donald Trump to lose support, but it's also going to take Democrats to gain support, and that's where we're still continuing to drop the ball, because we have not found the proper messenger, and more importantly than the messenger, we haven't still found the proper message. because there's too much infighting on our side still.
I would agree with you. Certainly when there's been discussions this week of a possible government shutdown, and you see and the Democrats are saying that they are possibly going to allow the government, well, they did their 2-week extension, but they're saying that they might possibly allow the government to shut down over DACA. That illustrates your point. To the average American out there who even cares about DACA, and I do,
right.
I don't want to see the government shut down over the DACA issue. That's not important enough to disrupt the lives of 320 million people over the DACA kids. Again, that might sound cold, but that's illustrative of your point that the Democrats have not found a message around which progressives and independents can rally.
Coalesce, right.
Large enough numbers to definitively defeat Donald Trump. I don't even think Donald Trump is concerned about it, because Donald Trump is such a tactician. He's not going to worry about 2020 until 2020.
Right. Well, my friend, this has been a wonderful conversation. I could really talk politics with you all day. Unfortunately, time is against us.
Always.
As always. So I want to take this moment to thank our audience today. We thank you so much for listening on Facebook Live, for listening on Intellectual Radio and YouTube, whatever medium you found us in. We thank you. Please feel free to share the show today. I'll be posting it momentarily on my Facebook wall, so feel free to listen to it and share it as well. We want to thank our producer, Mr. Breon Jones, our guest, Professor John Quigley, and of course, we want to thank Mr. Earl Winfrey for this wonderful and blessed platform. This is just great. We love being able to communicate with you guys like this. And I definitely want to thank my co-host, Mr. David Seaton, for bringing such insight, such professionalism and class to the conversation.
Only because you're here, my friend. I had to step my game up.
Shut up. And I want to wish him a happy early birthday.
Thank you, sir.
This is my Sagittarian brother right here, y'all.
That is correct.
So yeah, what is it? Monday, December 11th. He'll be 40 years old.
Yeah.
Yes, Lord. But we thank God for every year.
Right. Share the show to the people, to the friends of yours who are those religious people who think they know everything about the Bible, or people who are genuinely studiers of the Bible. Share that show, because we want to continue the conversation about the first half, about the city of Jerusalem being named capital of Israel by the person who occupies the White House, right. Donald Trump.
That's what we'll just call him.
I can't
do it. So everybody have a safe, wonderful weekend. Stay warm, because I don't think it's going to get any warm out there.
No, it is not.
And be careful when you're out there Christmas shopping. People are getting crazy. So take care. We'll see you guys next week on Humanity in the Headlines.